On June 6th, protests against ICE started popping up throughout the country, spanning coast to coast, in response to an aggressive uptick in ICE raids at the hands of the Trump administration. These raids are part of a new operation titled Operation at Large and are basically calling for thousands of federal agents across law enforcement agencies to facilitate mass deportations. Operation at Large is focused on a few things. Deportations with the primary goal of arresting thousands of people daily, making these arrests across workplaces, schools, churches, and residences with no exception, even taking place in cities known for their sanctuary status, as well as speeding up the deportation process by terminating court cases of certain migrants and using infamously error-prone surveillance tools like facial recognition to target those suspected to be undocumented. And many of those captured so far are people who have no criminal record, with arrests of non-criminal detainees up by 800% compared to those with actual charges and convictions, up at 91%. As a result, thousands across the country have come together to protest against these raids, and the speed at which these protests and other socio-political movements like these have organized, gained momentum, and most importantly, equipped protesters with the information necessary to protest safely in an environment where the federal government is aggressively extending its arms of power is directly tied to social media and the role social media plays in mobilizing movements like these in today's world. Before we get into the details of this particular movement, I want to note that this isn't the first time we've seen mass mobilization happen across social media. Just a few years ago in 2020, the George Floyd protests that took place across the country were fueled by social media. Infographics on Instagram, TikTok videos, and Twitter posts sharing information ranging from protest times and locations, and on-the-ground captures, as well as safety tips specifically geared towards protecting oneself from aggression from both local and federal authorities. In fact, social media was the reason why the video of George Floyd's murder was released and spread rapidly, because Darnella Fraser, the bystander who recorded the murder and ended up being a key witness to testify during the prosecution, posted it to Facebook on May 25th, 2020, where it then spread and reached millions of people by May 26th. And yeah, in a matter of days following that, protests broke out across the United States and even reached over 40 countries. People who had never been to a protest or had even been politically motivated before were all of a sudden participating and spreading the word about George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter movement because they were mobilized by what they were seeing on social media. Now, social media had already played a role in major socio-political movements before, like the Arab Spring protests in 2010 and 2011. But by the time 2020 came around, our relationships to social media had gone from occasional use to constant integration, because it wasn't just where people posted pictures and videos for family and friends to see. It was then where they got their news, they learned things, they expressed their opinions, and ultimately where they started to organize. Especially for younger generations who back during the Arab Spring protests were either too young to use social media or weren't fully plugged in yet. But by the time 2020 came around, they weren't only on social, they were using it every day, and they were also fluent in the language of it all. And that fluency played a major role in how quickly and massively the George Floyd protests were able to gain momentum. In doing my research for this video, I came across this peer-reviewed study published in the scientific journal PLOS One about the role that social media, specifically Instagram, played in the George Floyd protests. The study analyzed over 1.13 million posts during the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, and one of the key findings from this study was that within 3 days of the death of George Floyd, hashtag Justice for George Floyd was the most popular and widely used hashtag on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, which shows how pretty much instantaneously the very notion of justice for George Floyd, hence the hashtag, was beginning to mobilize on social media across a variety of platforms. More specifically, the type of content attached to these hashtags gaining so much momentum were symbols of injustice, like the raised fist, portraits of George Floyd, and photos from protests. And what was specifically noted in the study actually was that actual protest coverage was framed positively, which contrasted with the combatant frames that traditionally were found in legacy media. And this played a key role in positively shaping and also motivating the public's perception about protesting and what these protests stood for. And so when you take a hashtag like hashtag Justice for George Floyd that's trending across social media platforms and you attach it to content that frames the movement towards this justice positively, the level of engagement that comes from it signals to the social media algorithms to keep pushing it out to more people, essentially creating a feedback loop that rapidly boosts the visibility of the movement and motivates people to participate. So that was 2020. And what we're seeing now with the protests against ICE raids in 2025 feels like the next chapter in how social media mobilizes socio-political movements. Only now it's faster, it's more sophisticated, and quite frankly, it's even more effective. According to a news platform fact sheet from the Pew Research Center, 86% of adults in the US say that they at least sometimes get their news from a smartphone, computer, or tablet. And 57% of those 86% of people said they do so often, which is a pretty stark contrast to the 26% of adults in the US, so about a quarter, who say that they often or sometimes get their news in print. And you might be thinking, okay, just because someone gets their news from a device doesn't mean that that news is being consumed on social media, right? But when you look at the percentage of those 86% of adults who say that they at least sometimes get their news from a device, the percentage of those adults who prefer to get that news from social media is almost symmetrical with those who prefer to get their news from news websites. And when they compared the percentage of adults who regularly get news from social media platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, X, and Reddit in 2020 to 2024, that percentage increased. And in any that did see a decrease, that decrease was actually just pretty marginal. I wanted to mention this preference for social media as a news source and how it's grown over the last few years, because if people are choosing to get their news from social media over traditional news websites, then that means the consumption of news is decentralized and that people aren't just consuming their news from major outlets anymore. Though they are certainly present on social media, of course, but people are also consuming news from other players in the social media space, like independent journalists, on-the-ground witnesses, organizers, and creators, some of who are posting what's actually happening in real time. And this is exactly what we saw in the buildup to the protests against the ICE raids that have been happening since the beginning of Trump's second term, starting as early as late January and early February, which had cascading effects like migrant students staying home in fear of being arrested by ICE after the Trump administration lifted protections from ICE at schools. People who have been directly impacted by ICE or witnessed the effects of the ICE raids have taken to social media to share their experiences. And these conversations aren't even posted plainly.
Remember, kids, the next time that somebody tells you the government wouldn't do that, oh yes they would.
Oh, sir, did you witness anything strange in the area?
What, witness?
Yes.
Is this camera on?
Yeah, we're live.
Oh no, I ain't seen nothing. I ain't seen nothing. Matter of fact, I'm blind in my left eye.
They've been embedded into the language of social media using trending audio and formats that essentially weave these experiences that people are having with ICE into the everyday scrolls of social media. And because of that, the impacts of these ICE raids aren't just being talked about and presented as a news piece like they would on any regular news website or even social media profile. they're also being felt through firsthand accounts of lived experiences directly from the people living them. And that makes a big difference when you account for the fact that much of mainstream media, left or right, filters their storytelling through a political lens, whereas social media, on the other hand, puts the human experience front and center instead. And if it isn't personal anecdotes or trends, it's the dissemination of resistance tactics.
If you see an immigration truck or an immigration agent, what you're going to do is yell as loud as you possibly can, La Migra. And I mean at the top of your lungs. Make sure everyone around you can hear it. If there's any stores in the area, any restaurants, go in there and say, La Migra. Let them know that immigration is there. If an ICE agent comes up to you, do not confirm or deny anything. You have no idea who's an immigrant. You don't know anyone's legal status. Do not speculate either. If an ICE agent tries to talk to you, say, I'm sorry, I don't know, I can't help you, keep it moving. You do not owe them anything. Did you see something? No, you didn't. You didn't see anything. ICE agent comes to your door and nicely asks you, have you seen your neighbor? Do you know who this neighbor is? No, you don't. You have no clue. Actually, you've never even been in the street.
All of these examples I just showed you predate the recent protests in LA that have spread across the country. So what's gone down since the start of June, it isn't random. It isn't out of nowhere. It's the water that's been warming finally reaching a rolling boil, and that rolling boil being when ICE raided several parts of the LA area using military-style tactics, which prompted folks to respond very quickly via protest. These protests are probably an inevitable response to perceived state-sanctioned violence and injustices, meaning they might have happened regardless, but we cannot deny the role that social played and continues to play in mobilizing people, especially when you factor in emotional contagion, which is a psychological phenomenon where a person starts to mirror the emotions of the people around them, which was proven to be the case in context to social media in this study, where researchers edited users' news feeds to increase positive or negative emotions, and those exposed to more negative posts then posted more negative comments themselves, and the same was true in the reverse for those exposed to more positive content, proving that emotions can spread through what people see online, even without interacting with those things in real life. So if you take the phenomenon of emotional contagion and you apply it to what people have been seeing on social media with respect to the ICE raids, it makes sense that people would be motivated to take action. Now, when we talk about how the mechanics of how that motivation gets translated into real world action, the role social played and continues to play in facilitating the organization and mobilization of these protests is strong because it's essentially a billboard for movements. Protest locations get shared by accounts with large followings and then reshared and reposted, which are key engagement actions that signal social media algorithms to push content out further. Also, because these content pieces use keywords and searchable terms, that only adds to the reach and discoverability factor, since social media platforms are used like search engines, which means someone interested in participating or learning more about an upcoming protest can literally go into the search bar of TikTok or Instagram or X or whatever and search for the next protest happening near them. And this organization and mobilization gets taken to another level because it goes beyond protest location to mutual aid and even safety while participating. I mean, we know by now that protests do often end up in confrontation between civilian and agents of the state, which result in protesters being arrested, tear gassed, etc. And obviously, legacy media and standard news outlets aren't going to equip viewers with the information to protect themselves from this aggression. So protesters are doing it themselves, sharing tips on how to be unrecognized by surveillance technology, to how to maneuver confrontations with the police and even ICE itself. And this doesn't stop at protest logistics and safety either. This continues in the form of context by way of content creators, opinion leaders, noted in the PLOS1 study I mentioned earlier, which were regarded as top voices over politicians and traditional media and are playing that role today in the movement opposing ICE raids. Content creators, some who are experts in fields like law and politics and journalism, who people follow and encounter during their daily scrolls, are doing the work that traditional media often doesn't by breaking down the immigration situation, explaining the implications, and giving both historical and political context that helps people actually understand what's happening beyond the headlines and political banter that we see in the news.
The reason why we're in a big national fight over ICE right now, daywalking vampire Stephen Miller. A few weeks ago at a national meeting with ICE, Miller yelled at them and gave them entirely new directions. He said, "You're arresting people way too slowly. We need more." He said, "No longer are we targeting immigrants who have criminal records. Go after everybody. Get as many people as you can, as fast as you can." Miller told them he wants 3,000 arrests per day. And he wants showy arrests that look good on TV. They want to scare immigrants into self-deporting. They want to scare people who aren't here from ever even coming.
Okay, pause, because we need to talk about this. This right now is happening in California. This right here is because of ICE. Because of all the ICE raids that are happening. People are now protesting them as they should. Oh, but Mr. Holmes, they're just trying to do their job. They raided an elementary school graduation. I need you to let that sink in.
And of course, while these protests are going on, the implementation of trends and content formats and personal anecdotes and on-the-ground testimonies are being shared in real time and added into the algorithmic feedback loop that then spreads this information rapidly for all to see.
I can't handle this, y'all. This is crazy, yo. I didn't think this was about to affect me like this. But our neighbor school, y'all know I work at a school. Our neighbor in school, I think it's Gratas, I don't know how to say it. It's Gratas or something like that. They were having their graduation. And there's helicopters in the sky. Most of these schools are predominantly Hispanic. Gratas, I believe elementary, was having their graduation. And all of a sudden, a bunch of parents have to run out because ISIS is there. Because they don't have papers. And they had to leave their kids because the kids do. And then kids are freaking grabbing teachers and crying on their leg because they don't know if they're about to see their parents when they get home.
This socio-political movement has even reached Roblox, with kids cosplaying ICE against other kids cosplaying protesters holding signs that say things like F ICE, frick ICE, and keep families together. I mean, this really shows you just how powerful and far this movement has gone on social, because I'm sure these kids are not watching the news. They're hearing about this while scrolling TikTok and YouTube shorts. So yeah, social media has completely transformed how people come to understand injustice and how they mobilize in response to it. And as long as that remains constant, platforms won't just be where people scroll, they'll also be where movements are built. That's all for this video. My name is Crystal and I'm a freelance social media specialist. If you made it this far and you're interested in more about all things social media, so news, culture, and 101s, you might as well hit that subscribe button because there's more to come. Till next time.